flight of discovery. Here is Tom Brokaw at Kennedy Space Center.
Good morning, everyone. We're now about 10 minutes away from the scheduled launch of the Space Shuttle Discovery. This could be the most elaborate and expensive kickstart in history as NASA attempts to get the U.S. space program back into the race 32 months after the Shuttle Challenger blew up, killing 7 astronauts. The weather has been a problem all morning here at the Kennedy Space Center. Light winds at high altitudes were the problem early on, and then some conditions at the emergency landing sites around the world. But most of that now does appear to have been solved. And there on Launch Pad 39B, the orbiter is in place. All 5 astronauts are in their pressure suits and locked into place, and they're talking with the control room here. It's 32 months after the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, of course, and this is an attempt to soften the memory of that. After all, after our long and romantic involvement, for most of us, that great tragedy was like a sudden death in our own family. And so today, well, the payload is a relay and tracking satellite to be used by other space systems. The real mission here is to, as I say, soften the memory of Challenger and to reignite the commitment of the American people to the U.S. space program. Everyone here has a lot riding on the successful launch today of the Space Shuttle Discovery. Final go, no-go decision will be made by Navy Captain Robert Crippen, who is one of the most experienced of the astronauts. There will be no confusion on communications this time. He'll go through the various checkpoints, about 25 in all, and he'll say go or no-go from that room. Standing by as well with my colleague, NBC science correspondent Robert Bazell. Robert, it does look better for the weather at this hour, I gather.
That's right, Tom. There's no problem with the weather here at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. There's some problem with some of the transatlantic sites. That's where they would land in an emergency, but there's one in Spain that's fine. There's no problem at Edwards Air Force Base. The early problem was with upper-level winds, which, as you mentioned, were too light, which might have been a problem because the computer software on board the Discovery couldn't handle them. They've done an analysis of the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Apparently, they think they can handle the current situation. There was no indication that they really got within acceptable limits, but they think they can handle it now, and it looks like a go for launch in terms of weather.
All right, thank you very much, Bob Bazell. Even with these holes that we've been experiencing all morning long, NASA has been clicking right through its predetermined schedule. It got the astronauts up on time this morning, even though those winds were unacceptable at an early hour. They had breakfast, and then they got into their pressure suits, and then that familiar picture that we have not seen for such a long time, in fact, 32 months. These are the 5 astronauts from Discovery, who are all veterans. They represent the very best of breed in the American space program. NASA wants nothing to go wrong this time. They're led by Navy Captain Rick Houck, pilot from the Air Force, mission specialist. All of them have been in space before in the shuttle program. No civilians on this flight. Whether there ever will be again, that's a question that remains, of course. We want to tell you that they are in the orbiter right now. They're going through their checklist. And here, going through our checklist with us this morning, 2 veterans of the American space program, one of whom has been with us before, Dr. Joe Kerwin, of course, who is no longer with NASA, but he is now with Lockheed, and Al O'Hara, who had to make these decisions as a launch director once before. Mr. O'Hara, let's begin with you if we can this morning. There are a lot of constraints on the conditions for launch today, and they're not going to let anything be marginal. Do you think that these kinds of constraints will continue if they have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 successful launches in a row?
I don't think so, Tom. On the second flight of this vehicle, we're already planning to reduce the testing based upon the in-flight data. So it's obvious that we need to be conservative this time, but on future flights, the checkout time will be reduced in the orbiter processing facility and as the launch rates go up. So I'm very confident that after this flight, we get back in flight again, gather data, we'll be able to reduce that turnaround time.
Joe Kerwin, there have been about 500 modifications on the space shuttle, but people are going to look and say, what's different? But the design remains fundamentally the same, doesn't it?
Sure it does. Yeah, we can't go through all 500 mods, but it's constantly improving a given design is a good way to go. And I think that's the way the Soviets have gone in their program, to stay with the old designs and constantly improve them. And
what about what's happening with the space program itself? After the Challenger, did the program take a hit in terms of people being committed to it who might now go into other scientific endeavors?
Yes, I think so. NASA has found it more difficult to recruit the brightest young engineers and scientists. been a good deal of talk about how wonderful it was in the old days, and can we ever get back to those good old days? The answer, I think, is let's get ahead to some good new days. I'm looking forward to seeing an 8-person International Space Station crew launch out of here, and the prospect of that will motivate people and make them want to come work for NASA.
You sat here with me on so many occasions in the past, Joe, both here and at Edwards and the landing. Did we just allow the American people, and did I become, in a way, I suppose, too complacent about this very complex procedure and high-risk adventure of going into space?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose we all did. We said in those early days we wanted the shuttle to become routine. We wanted a shuttle launch to be, well, maybe a little bit more exciting than the launch of a Continental or a Delta jet out of Orlando. Maybe it'll never be that way. Maybe it shouldn't.
Let's listen now to launch control.
Who is the Deputy Director of the National Space Transportation System and the head of the mission management team. We'll be picking up the countdown clock at 11:28 at the T-minus 9-minute point, which would give us a liftoff time at 11:37 Eastern Daylight Time this morning. During this period, recorders which document the operation of the final minutes of the countdown, and the flight recorders have been turned on.
All right, so there has been
Just
some
1 minute
slippage
before
now.
the countdown resumes.
They're going to resume the countdown at T-minus 9 at 11:28, and then we'll be going at 11:37 if all conditions remain in place. We're here at the Kennedy Space Center in the NBC booth. You heard so much about the O-rings. Those were the real improvements, of course, in the design of this Space Shuttle system. Here's an old O-ring. I'll give you some comparison now. And here is the improved version of it. I've got to be careful because I'm not really an engineer. In fact, a lot of people who know me will say this guy can't screw in a light bulb, and what's he doing talking about O-rings? The fact of the matter is that you can see that the new one is a much heavier piece. It's got 3 pins where there were 2 before. And that, of course, made the big difference, they hope, in the solid rocket boosters. We want to show you now what those solid rocket boosters look like. They are the 2 Roman candles, in effect, which are on either side of the stack. And when they fire off, that lifts the orbiter off the pad. They are so powerful that they have to have some flex built into them. But what happened the last time is that they blew apart because of adverse weather conditions. They had been cold, and they stiffened up, and that's what caused the Challenger disaster. So they've made improvements in that, in the solid rocket booster. They've made improvements in the orbiter as well, and they've made improvements in the big external tank. That's the big brown tank that has all the fuel for the main engines, which are necessary once they get into orbit, and also on liftoff as well. We're going to show you what we're talking about here. This is the model. Well, there are the O-rings that you can see, and that's where the gas escaped from. This is the model that we're talking about. This is the orbiter itself. We have to go through this again. The big external tank, which was painted orange originally, and then they discovered they didn't need the paint, so they saved the weight. And these are the solid rocket boosters, which they hope can be recovered, and they've added a 3rd O-ring to these sections because they take so much stress. On liftoff, it has to have some kind of give. And what happened last time, it just simply wasn't the flexibility. They came apart, and it ignited this entire apparatus here, which is the equivalent of an atomic bomb. I mean, it weighs 4,500,000 pounds at liftoff. So you know what happened at that time. So they think that they've made the adequate arrangements. They've also made an improvement in the landing gear, so if they have what they call an AOA, which is an abort once around, that they can land the orbiter in a more safe fashion. And there's something else as well on this.
The ground launch sequencer is part of the launch processing system.
We're back now on the countdown, so they're on schedule. This is the crucial countdown from 9 minutes on down. Let's listen for just a few moments.
System that the commands have been executed. 8 minutes, 30 seconds, and counting. The primary job of the onboard computers is to check that all of the launch commit criteria, such as propellant loads, temperatures, pressures, and other measurements, are normal and staying within their prescribed limits.
Okay, we're in the countdown now. We'll go through this 9-minute countdown. It'll get crucial down around 2 minutes again when the computer programs start to check in, make sure that everything's all right. And they were even giving us one warning that there may be some kind of an alarm in the cockpit because they've got these new pressure suits on that they're wearing, and they're worried about the pressure giving off a different kind of signal that may set some of those very sensitive alarms. 5-man crew on board. You should meet them because you'll be hearing a lot about The Discovery crew, all pros, each has flown on the shuttle at least once. 4 of the 5 have military backgrounds. Training has been intense, practicing longer on their ground, spending more than 400 hours in simulators alone. No crew has ever worked harder. Navy Captain Rick Houck, 48 years old, is commander. He flew on both Challenger and Discovery.
I think we're very well trained. I think we're ready to fly. I think we've been ready to fly for several months now.
38-year-old Marine Colonel David Hilmers is one of 3 mission specialists on board.
We can't dwell on what happened in the past, or we'll never look forward to the future.
Air Force Colonel Dick Covey, 42, is pilot. He flew on Discovery in 1985. All test pilots know that spaceflight is inherently dangerous.
As long as we have to ride rockets into Earth orbit, there's going to be a substantial risk. No matter how well you design your solid rocket motors or your main engines, there's going to be a risk.
38-year-old George Pinky Nelson, mission specialist. He's an astronomer. Mike Lounge, 41 years old, was a former Navy pilot. Like all the others, they're all married. They all have children. Daughter Kathy is 4 years old.
Kathy has several times said, Daddy, you're going to go fly the Space Shuttle, and it's not going to blow up, right? Asking me for some reassurance, and once she gets that, then it must be okay. You know, Daddy said it wouldn't, and so it won't. That's enough for her.
5 astronauts, often described as seasoned, cool, laconic, macho. The right stuff. 5 astronauts now in place in the Space Shuttle Discovery, going through the final moments of the countdown. We're now getting very close to what is expected to be one of the most important liftoffs in American space history, of course, an attempt to get the Space Shuttle program underway once again. Part of the modification, of course, of this system is that they now have 2 escape systems, one for the ground, one that once they're airborne, if they were at where they were, for example, on the Challenger, there is now a system that has been put in place that they hope will work. We want to show you how that might be put into effect. These astronauts are equipped with parachutes, and they'll have a space escape pole. There's no other way to describe it. It's kind of a space fire pole, in effect. They'll go out of the orbiter just like that. If they're at...
All clear. 4, 3.
All right, we're watching all of that with a lot of pros. Joe Engel, who's in Houston with us this morning and flew in the second space shuttle. Do you think that that system has got a lot of hazard built into it, that escape system, Joe? Do you really think that it could work?
Well, no doubt about it, it can work, Tom. It's been tested, and they've checked it out thoroughly. And for the envelope that it's designed, I think it's probably going to give a real good assurance that those guys can get out if they get into that situation.
But they'd have to do that in the first few moments of the flight, wouldn't they? Because once they get up too high, they simply wouldn't be able to use it.
Well, not necessarily. They can glide back to within the parameters as long as they can get the vehicle back under control, glide back into the atmosphere, and get a stabilized glide situation set up. Then they can get set up to blow the hatch and use the escape system.
Okay, thank you, Joe Engel, who will be with us this morning from Houston as well. All of this cost, by the way, $2.5 billion to make these modifications. That's a small price indeed. We're now coming up on just under 4 minutes to the countdown. And at this point, the crew is going through a checklist that they have on board there. Let's listen for a few moments to Hugh Harris.
T-minus 3 minutes, 30 seconds. All 3 engines now being moved in a pattern to verify their readiness to support the ascent flight control. After going through their paces, they'll be aligned to their start positions. We're coming up on the 3-minute point in the count at T-minus 2 minutes, 55 seconds. The start of the external tank liquid oxygen pressurization will begin. 3 minutes and counting. And the gaseous nitrogen purges of the main engines will be terminated.
Those main engines you can see there at the bottom, those big cones sticking out from the bottom, are going to be crucial, of course, for both liftoff and then later on we'll be seeing those engines in the flight with those close-up NASA cameras. We want to tell you that there are a couple of crucial sequences coming up. Al O'Hara, you've watched this in the past. They're going to have to pressurize the big liquid hydrogen get down to, what, about 31 seconds, everything goes on automatic in effect.
Automatic. The computers take over on board. There's no more intervention from the firing room. It's automatically cut off if there's a problem. That's a critical milestone in the countdown, the last 28 seconds.
All right, we're getting ready, obviously, to deal with the big external tank here.
Yes, that's the nose cone that's placed over it to keep any icing off of the tip of the nose cone, and that will be removed now, and it will just vent to atmosphere. They pressurized the tank at this point in time to build up pressure to force the propellants out when the engines ignite. So those big vents have been closed, and this is a key milestone as we go toward launch.
Part of the problem, of course, with the Challenger was that it was very cold here overnight on that January in Florida in 1986. What about launching in adverse weather conditions when there is a cold snap again, as there will be?
Well, they placed heaters on the solid rocket booster joints this time, and if there is any cold weather, that should keep them warm
90
enough.
seconds and counting. Less than 2 minutes away from the launch of STS-26 and its crew of 5. And we have heard that the clock will hold at 31 seconds.
Now, that means that there's a hold just before they begin the automatic sequence, so that we are in...
We're anticipating the clock will hold at T-minus 31 seconds due to a failure. We have not heard what that is yet.
It's going down.
That's a normal hold point in the event that there is
Probably due to the increase in the O2 going into the suit. Okay, with your concurrence, we'll clear the air.
The propulsion hydraulic system can hold for 6 minutes today in order to protect the launch for tomorrow. And the APUs have started. They will continue to run. So if we don't hold any more than 6 minutes, we could reschedule tomorrow if there is a problem that causes us to switch.
We will not stop the clock. The orbiter computers have vent doors, T-minus 31 seconds. We have a go for auto-sequence start.
The problem has been cleared.
Redundant computers have assumed T-minus 23 seconds and counting. The SRB nozzle profile. T-minus 15.
Here we go.
14.
Remember the Challenger.
13, 12,
Godspeed Discovery.
11, 10. We're go for main engine start. 7, 6. Start. 3, 2, 1, 0. And liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Crew confirms roll program. Houston now controlling. 3 engines at 104%. Very good APUs, 3 good fuel cells. Standing by to begin throttle down to 65%. Engines throttling down now to maintain a certain speed as the spacecraft passes through max Q. Standing by to see engines begin to throttle back up at about 59 seconds. Mark 1 minute. Velocity 2,300 feet per second. Altitude 5.9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Discovery, go at throttle up.
Discovery given a go at throttle up. 3 engines at 104%. Velocity 3,200 feet per second. Altitude 10.8 nautical miles. Downrange distance 8 nautical miles.
We've passed a crucial test here, gentlemen. Go to throttle up was the last command that we heard, of course, on Challenger.
Yes.
We're waiting for the separation of those big solid rocket boosters that you see on either side.
At 25 seconds from solid rocket booster separation.
They held. The orbiter is in place. It's
1
gonna lose
minute,
those
45
rockets, and then
seconds,
it's gonna
3
lose that
engines
big
at
external tank
104%.
next, if everything goes well, which it looks like now it will.
Velocity 4,800 feet per second. Altitude 20 nautical miles. Downrange distance 19 nautical miles. Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
There they go.
Looks normal.
Yep.
Looks great.
Yep. Looks great.
Solid rocket boosters have separated. 2 minutes, 20 seconds. 3 engines still running 104%. 5,600 feet per second velocity, 31.8 nautical miles. Altitude, downrange distance 38 nautical miles.
to be objective. That looks very clean indeed. Mr. O'Hara, you're our expert. That was a pretty clean launch.
Here,
It was a beautiful
call-ups
launch.
here shortly from the captain.
We waited for this a long time. I'm sure people in the firemen in Houston are really excited. Of course, we'll be totally stressful when we land at Edwards Air Force Base. A lot of the mission ahead of us, but this has been a great launch.
Well, we've still got to hit the orbit here. We've got work to do yet today.
Absolutely.
But they got through the critical area with the light winds. The computer program's held. Everything is looking good. The solid rocket boosters are all in place. And they separated off, and that's launch pad 39B. And standing outside is NBC's Robert Bazell, who got the full effect once again of the sound and the fury, and in this case, the joyful reverberation of the Space Shuttle Discovery, Bob.
Well, Tom, like you said, it's a little bit difficult to be objective. First, there was when the countdown clock went past 31 seconds, which means that the onboard computers took over, and the great cheer that went up with all the employees here at the Kennedy Space Center, that was fantastic. And of course, the moment of liftoff, when we felt the enormous power of Discovery, and then when that go for throttle up, everybody holding their breath, we went past it, America's back in space. I must admit, I feel very happy, and it was really thrilling. It was one of the most thrilling things that's ever happened to me as a reporter.
Well, there are many questions still about the American space program, but from a purely human point of view, who could not be thrilled that this has worked today? Because we have all lived with this in our own way, all of us. People who would never forget the Challenger. Now they can remember this launch today of the Discovery, an aptly named shuttle that is on its way to orbit, and things are looking very good at this time. We want to tell you that this mission will be 4 days altogether. They're going to launch primarily a relay and tracking data system satellite up there on the first day. But what they're going to do most of all is kind of get their own confidence back and reinstill the confidence of the American people in the space program. Joe Engel in Houston, you were as I said earlier, with Dick Truly as your partner. You went up on the second of these space shuttle launches. What did you think of today's?
I tell you, Tom, that was magnificent. It's a real tribute to the people, not just the thousands of people who worked to get the shuttle ready to go again, but particularly that launch team. After better than 2.5 years to go through a very complex launch procedure like that and pull it off the first time through, that's a tremendous tribute.
You were a crack pilot, so was Dick Truly, of course, and Rick Houck, who is in the commander of this flight today, is one of the very best in the astronaut corps. Do you think we're going to have to keep the standards at that level, or do you think that down the road again that we can begin to permit people to go up in the shuttle who are not necessarily best of breed in the astronaut corps, civilians and others?
Well, I don't think there's anything magic in going up in the shuttle, Tom. I think that for sure the considerations have to be made as to why those people are going, and to accept the fact that, as we've said so many times, there's a lot of risk involved in the program. And I think that was the biggest shock to everybody. We had people on board that were not professional astronauts, and I think that shocked a good number of folks.
Okay, Joe Engel, thanks very much for being with us this morning. I want to tell you that everything is looking good right now for the Space Shuttle Discovery on its launch today. It got off on a small delay, about 1 hour and 35 minutes altogether. That was a result of weather conditions, no problems on board the system itself. And a man who's getting in place now flew on the equivalent of the Model T in the American space program.
Somehow I resemble that remark.
Senator John Glenn of Ohio, of course, was the first American to orbit the Earth, and he gave us his own thrill when you did that. John, how many years ago was that now?
Well, a few too many. I guess it was 26 years ago last February, so it's getting to be ancient history by now. But this was a great morning here. It really went well.
Senator, what about the future of the American space program? A lot of people believe that we've got too much of our resources tied up in this space shuttle system, too much tied up in a manned space program, that we can do it more efficiently in terms of these launches, and we ought to be looking at things like space stations and more space exploration.
Well, I think there'll always be a balance between the two programs. I think there's some missions can obviously be performed better on an unmanned vehicle, a single launch of whatever the lighter payload is. But this is a very versatile vehicle, and I have favored the shuttle approach from the word go. I think they're complementary programs, manned and unmanned. Wherever people learn to travel in space, we're always going to precede our visits there with unmanned spacecraft to give us as much information as we can about the environment we're going into. And that's the role of that. But men and women going into space can work in a laboratory of space, such as the orbiting space laboratory that we'll have up there one of these days in the mid-'90s, and do far more. It's like, if you think on Earth, on a laboratory, could you remotely from outside the laboratory do as well as going in the lab and conducting the experiments yourself? The answer is obviously no. So there's a place for both programs.
But
so than this past administration has done. They've said all the right things, but the budget support's been somewhat weak on occasion.
This kind of a successful launch today and all the romance that comes with it and the human drama, that probably helps in terms of getting the American people back behind it again.
It helps, but you know, Tom, ever since I was in the program myself back in those days, I have stressed the research return that's going to be of value to everybody right here on Earth.
Senator, we're just going to show you what's going on up there right now, if I can just engage you in this, because we're going to listen to NASA. Big external tank is...
main engine cutoff confirmed.
And that means...
Discovery's three main engines have now shut down as programmed.
Another very crucial stop along the way as they go into the... as they get themselves into a position to go into orbit.
Holmes 1 not required.
Don't have to make the maneuver. They went more straight up this time, you may have noticed, because they inserted themselves in a different configuration. They wanted to reduce the number of maneuvers that they might normally have to make so that they could go right straight up and get into an orbit with as much efficiency as possible.
Standing by for external tank separation.
Standing by. We're standing by for external tank separation. We were a little premature on our simulation there. That has not yet happened. Ours doesn't count. This one does.
Discovery, your go for APU shutdown on time.
Roger.
The auxiliary power units is what they're shutting down on time. Everything has met the timeline so far, no problems that we've been able to hear. Let's just get the external tank separated if we can, which should come at any moment now. That's that big brown tank that fuels those main engines, which have now been shut down, but then you've got to get rid of it. And when they get rid of it, it breaks up and it falls into the ocean over a long, wide path. Pieces of it have, I don't know whether they've ever been recovered or not. There was some concern in the early days that they would rain across Australia. That really didn't happen. It breaks up into so many small pieces that it just generally goes into the ocean. The solid rocket boosters, of course, are recovered. Senator Glenn, you were saying that I raised the proposition that if this goes well from a human point of view, people will get involved in the romance of space again. Do you think that we invest too much in the romance of space?
That's a factor, and the romance of space seems to come in as we go into the first, whether it's Al Shepard's first suborbital, my orbital, and the other first steps that occur beyond that. But, you know, the value of the program is basic research, and if this nation is a product of anything, it's the basic research that we've been willing to support through the years. That, plus I don't think most Americans want to see us second place in space. Space has been a focal point of attention. The rest of the world has been a demonstration of our superiority in science and technology. And what we have found are tens upon thousands of kids wanting to come here to get their education. Now, that results in political followership around the world. And I don't want to see the children of the world aspiring to go to Patrice Lumumba University in the Soviet Union as opposed to coming to Florida, Caltech, Ohio State, or wherever in this country. So there's that political aspect of the space program also.
All right, Senator, we're going to look at that launch one more time.
Good. I'd like to see it again.
Okay. Let's take a look now. This is the successful launch now about 12 minutes ago here at the Kennedy Space Center.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Crew confirms roll program. Houston now controlling. 3 engines at 104%. Very good HQs, very good fuel cells. Standing by to begin throttle down to 65%. Engine throttling down now to maintain a third speed as the spacecraft passes through max Q.
Well, whatever you think of the space program, for my money at least, that is one of the most memorable and striking pictures that anyone can ever see. The absolute epitome of high technology. All that power, all those computers on board, and then, of course, 5 highly skilled American astronauts, their hands on the controls, going into space. It really is the definition of adventure.
Velocity 2,300 feet per second, altitude 5.9
Senator Glenn, thanks very much for being with us this morning. We're going to go down to Houston now, and we have NBC's Dan Molina standing by with an active member of the astronaut corps who's watching this with NBC News Today. Dan?
Good morning, Tom. I'm here with Colonel John Blaha. John is someone who became familiar to us over the years as a Capcom in mission control, the Capcom being the person who communicates back and forth with shuttles in flight, and Colonel Blaha is now training for an upcoming flight himself. And I know that you were quite thrilled to see that liftoff successful this morning.
It was fantastic, Dan.
The primary task of this flight is the deployment of the TDRA satellite, the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite System. Now, there is one operating right now. There was one on board Challenger when Challenger exploded. This then will be the second in a series of 3 that will operate for very important reasons today.
Correct, Dan.
Okay, Dan?
Can you summarize? Yes, Tom.
Yes. We're just going to break away for a moment. We want to go to NASA because we want to hear the celebration that is going on there.
Fine.
Well, to start with, wow. That was really something. It's been a long wait, 2.5 years or a little bit better than that. You guys have been working your tails off for the last, I don't know how long, long hours, overtime, fixed all the problems, ready to go. When it's time to go, we went. All I can say is that the nation owes you a lot, and will continue to owe you a lot in the months and years to come. This is the first of a new era, as we've said before. Congratulations for a job well done.
That's James Fletcher, who is the chief administrator of NASA. And, of course, there was an enormous shakeup. The length and breadth of that organization following the Challenger.
Just let me also
the lines of authority now are much more clearly drawn, including the decision today whether to make the launch. Dick Truly and Robert Crippen, who were 2 veteran astronauts themselves, were both on site, as it were. Truly is a Navy admiral who now lives in Washington and works out of there. He was in charge of the flight operations. Crippen was the guy who was on the ground here today, and he was making the final decision about whether or not they would launch. And he was he had a very active role, obviously, in the decision about how they would make the modifications. The astronauts, after the Challenger explosion, decided that they absolutely had to get involved. With us now is someone who's been following all of this with more than passing interest, is Dr. Logsdon from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Good morning. What about the space policy of this country? That's the area that interests you most of all.
Indeed.
You've been studying it.
Well, the launch of the shuttle gets us back in the right direction. It gets this immense psychological burden off our back of having failed once and correcting that failure. Now we have to look toward the future. We have to see whether the shuttle can make 18 missions before the end of 1990, whether we're going to proceed with a permanently manned space station, and for what reasons, the kind of reasons that Senator Glenn talked to, and I think ultimately the broadest human adventure of expanding human activity beyond the immediate vicinity of this planet, out to the moon, ultimately to Mars.
Do you think the American people are committed to spending that kind of money?
I think the American people expect the program to head down that direction. The money involved in absolute terms is large. In terms of a percentage of a GNP, we're spending less than 1/4 of the money we spent at the time of Apollo. The resources are there for good ideas.
Dr. Logsdon from the Space Policy Institute.
At George Washington University.
George Washington University. Thanks very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
We want to tell you that everything remains on schedule with the Space Shuttle Discovery itself. It is expected to go into orbit at about 12:20 today, Eastern Daylight Time. It'll go into an orbit that's about 160 nautical miles by 161 nautical miles. That's 184 by 185 if you make that conversion. And later this afternoon, it will be deploying the satellite that it is carrying in the payload. We have to go back through that again. You'll remember that this opens up here on top. These payload doors open up, and then they've got a little launching motor in there that will put out this very important satellite that we have here, which is the Tracking and Relay Data Satellite. That's used by other space programs so that they can communicate back to Earth. One of those was destroyed when we had the Challenger explosion. So that's what's ahead this afternoon. 4 days of this flight to land at Edwards Air Force Base in California. You'll remember that as well. That's the home originally of Chuck Yeager, and he'll probably be there for the landing. Let's go back to Houston now. Dan Molina is there. Dan?
Yes, Tom, we were discussing that sequence during which the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite will be deployed, and John Blaha with me is somebody who, over the years, felt the need for that satellite to be deployed and for a system that would allow space shuttles to communicate with mission control over a much longer period of time, much more constantly than they're able to now. I know that has been a big headache for you over the years, Colonel Blaha.
Absolutely, Dan. Getting 2 tracking and data relay satellites up in orbit will give us a communication capability which will expand the capabilities of the shuttle and of future payloads which we plan to put up.
The first TDRS, tracking data relay satellite, that was launched had problems when it was first launched. It's only operating with a portion of its total capacity right now. So it has been very slow getting this whole system up to full speed, has it not?
That's correct, Dan. Currently, the uplink capability of KU band doesn't work with the current satellite that's up there, and we hope that this one, plus the one which the crew that I'm with on the flight in February, will give us that full capability.
Now, the deployment sequence for this satellite will occupy the crew beginning almost immediately. They will begin the sequence which will result in the launch of that satellite. To go through that just briefly, it is a deployment sequence that first begins when the payload bay doors open. And then that satellite is tilted up into a position where it will be sprung out into space. Is that correct?
That's correct, Dan. And that activity will take place, the raising, about 4 hours from now. And the deployment about 6 hours from now.
And then the satellite will move a safe distance away from the spacecraft. The bottom of the spacecraft will be pointed toward the satellite when it ignites its engine and moves out into space. And Tom, hopefully that will go off without any hitches.
Okay, thank you very much. Dan Molina, who is in Houston today, and back here at the Kennedy Space Center with me now is Joe Kerwin. Joe, we've only got about 30 seconds left or so. What do you think? Next year at this time, we'll be launching on a very regular basis?
Well, we're going to have to work back into it. But the reason this launch was so expensive is because it took so long to get it airborne. The more often we launch, the more the cost will come down. And getting that railroad running on a regular schedule again, I'm sure, is our top priority.
Thanks very much, Joe Kerwin, for being with us, Al O'Hara, and all the people who helped us today. Special Discovery has been launched. We're going into orbit in about 20 minutes. I'm Tom Brokaw. We'll be here all day long bringing you up to date on what's going on, and I'll see you, of course, tonight on NBC Nightly News from the Kennedy Space Center. For now, good morning and good afternoon.
The clock will hold at T-minus 31 seconds due to a failure. We have not heard what that is yet.
It's going down. Probably due to the increase in the O2 going in from the suits. Okay, with your concurrence, we'll clear the air and proceed.
T-minus 50 seconds and counting. We're going to clear the air and proceed. 1, 0, and liftoff. Liftoff. Americans return to space as Discovery clears the tower.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Crew confirms roll program. Houston now controlling.
Monday, rise and shine with Today. Join Jane Pollock.